Hey there, everybody, and welcome to this month's training where we're going to be diving in deep to one of my favorite topics, which is talking about neutrals. I am a big fan of the neutral colors. One of my favorite things to talk about, or one of my favorite sayings about neutrals, is that they really are the secret sauce. They're the things that make all of the other colors look so incredibly rich. So before we dive in, just a little bit of quick housekeeping for anybody who hasn't been on here live before. You want to make sure you have all other streaming devices turned off. So Google Drive, Spotify, Netflix, any of those things, turn them off right now so you have the most available bandwidth. Then number two, I want everybody to open up the chat roll right now. And if you're on desktop, it's going to be right about here. And it's the idea bubble with 3 dots on it. Click that. If you're on mobile, it could be to the top or the side. Get that open right away. Then second thing there is down towards the bottom of the chat roll is a box that says type message here. That's where you're going to enter any questions or comments you have. To make sure that everybody gets to see those, that's the best learning environment, I want you to go ahead and click where it says all panelists and switch it to everyone in the meeting. That way, everybody will get to see any and all of the comments and questions that might come up, and you get a better conversation going. So get that done before we get going any further at all. And without further ado, I'm going to dive on into how to mix neutrals, the secret sauce for color. A lot of times when people think about increasing the range of color in their paintings, all they really end up doing is grabbing all of the screaming colors, all of the full intensities, and putting them right next to each other. And while, yeah, that will increase the overall intensity of the color in your paintings, what it does is it just sets up a situation where all of the colors are screaming equally for attention. And what you want, what the ideal is when you're dealing with color, is that you get a full range of all 4 aspects. So remember that there are 4 aspects to color. You have value, the lightness or darkness of a color. You have hue, its position on the color wheel. Then you have intensity, which is the brightness or the dullness of a color. It's the saturation of a color. And then you have temperature, its apparent warmth or coolness. Most people rely on value almost completely to create a sense of form and light in their paintings. You can start using those other 3, you'll get a much richer painting. So the one we're focusing on entirely today is intensity. So you want that range to go from very bright, fully saturated pure pigment to very dull and neutral in saturation. That's what we mean by neutrals. It means that you've got an equal presence of complementary colors. That's what creates a neutral, is a mixture of complements. So you get richer neutrals when you mix them than when you take something that's already neutralized as a pigment, inherently as a pigment. So we're going to look at some of those in a minute. So a good example of that would be the difference between a gray mixed with black and white paint and a gray that's mixed from 2 complements. The one that's mixed from 2 complements has the presence of all 3 of the primaries in there. And that's going to make for a richer color experience than just mixing black and white. So really becoming adept at using neutrals, it's going to activate your paintings in a way that nothing else can. And you actually won't have to use quite as intense a color because the neutrals will contrast with the more intense colors and make them appear to be brighter. So they can do all sorts of heavy lifting for you in ways that value alone just can't do. So let's look at an example of one that I'm talking about. And I have a whole bunch pulled up for y'all. So I've got, oops, now why did it do that? Well, I know why. I had multiple things open at one time, so it did not share the screen. Let me go back over here and see if I can share the screen again, because it did not like the fact that I had all of those things open. Okay, this one is Clear Winter Light. And it is a painting of big, huge open hay fields in the late afternoon with the evening light falling across the fields. And because I've heavily used neutrals in that foreground, your attention gets focused where there are more intense colors. It's the only real places in the painting, other than the sky, where there's some intense color. Right there at the top of the trees, right here, and a little tiny bit over here. So you have the intensity of the blue up above, which is not nearly as intense as the violet on the trees or that light striking that building. The sunlight that is illuminating that roof, those roof lines there. And that creates the focal point, that little orange reflective roof. It's actually a big arena, horse arena, a big barn arena area, becomes the focal point with the two little subordinate roofs that are phthalo and reflecting a shadow color instead. So there's variation in that foreground in intensity and value, but it's not fighting for your attention the same way as that far distant line is. It would not be nearly as effective if the foreground had more intensity to it. One of the reasons that part of that is just from observation. As you look toward the light, the foreground goes into lower contrast and the background goes into higher contrast. It's one of the things that happens in atmospheric perspective when you're looking towards the light source and the sun went down right behind those tree lines right there, is that the foreground becomes much less important. So you have a lot less contrast there. Let's look a little close. Let me see if I can make this blow up a little bit so that you can see a little bit more of that contrast in the foreground. So it's subtle, and it goes from a cooler dark to a slightly warmer light, but they're all still neutrals. So these colors right here, I'm going to show you how I mixed those in just a few minutes. Those are some of my favorite neutrals because they so easily capture that neutral color on fields and sand and things that have a more neutral color like grasses and sands and sidewalks and roads. At that particular time of day, they become very violet. And when you take violet and mix it with its complement, which is yellow, you get some extraordinarily beautiful neutral colors that have a hint of color to them, but are not nearly as saturated as these background colors. So that's one example. And let's go to another one that actually is a really similar lighting situation. And in this one, another sunset, and I actually think I pulled up the one that's for print, so the color is not quite as intense as it actually is in the painting. The foreground, again, because you're looking towards the light source, is lower in contrast. And the neutrals across that field help to play off and focus your attention on the color that's in the sky. If the sky was having to fight with the land for the attention, you would have dueling focal points. So using intensity can help to very clearly delineate where that focal point is. It can help to very clearly delineate the kind of atmospheric perspective or depth that you're creating. It can help to shape a viewer's understanding of where that light source is. And again, the colors that I used there in that foreground are really similar to the last one. There's a little bit less violet in it, but it's still that violet yellow mixture. To be specific, it's violet and yellow ochre, because ochre is just a little bit duller anyway, and it makes super rich, beautiful lavenders for the neutral part of the landscape. One more, and then we're going to look at how I mixed some of those by looking at the color wheel. And this one is actually those same fields you saw in the first one. You may recognize those tree lines, different time of day, different time of year. It's right in the middle, actually pretty close to the same time of year, just different time of day, and there had been snow. So the gray that is on the landscape there, that's the brush showing through the snow. The plowed rows in the fields showing through, coming up through the snow. And that gray is not out of the tube. That gray was mixed from violet and ochre and a little bit of white. So that really has become one of my go-to neutrals for landscape painting. It creates a much richer neutral than if I just mixed it with either black and white. So to see where those colors come from, and to realize too that the neutrals don't have to just come from purple and ochre or purple and yellow. You can get a gorgeous range of neutrals from any set of complementary colors. So let's look at that color wheel and see what some of our options are. So right here on the color wheel, you can see this is the double primary palette. So it's that warm and cool red, you can see the labels on there, a warm and a cool blue, and a warm and a cool yellow. The two yellows are Indian yellow and yellow ochre. Now I use yellow ochre because it is very handy if you're a landscape painter and you're mixing a lot of greens. It also because Indian yellow is such almost a pure yellow that you can mix almost all of the pure yellows from that, all the way from yellow orange to lemon yellow. So right here in this middle row, you can see a range from violet here to yellow ochre here. And all three of these in the middle have different amounts of violet and yellow ochre. The one that's in the center is about half yellow and half violet. So it's almost completely neutral. That means that it is a tonal gray, but it's a much richer gray, again, not to beat a dead horse, than if I had mixed it from black and white. Let's look at it a little larger. And you can see how it's got undertones of both the violet and undertones of the yellow. And it's the presence of those two things together that makes that kind of neutral color so rich. It's just like in music when you have a chord. A chord is made up of two notes that have a relationship. And when they're played together, they create a certain rich harmony. Same is true of complementary colors. They create a rich harmony that you can't get any other way. So some other options as far as mixtures, and you're going to see several of these in just a minute. Some other options that we've got available are thinking about mixing blue and orange, another great pair of complements. Now that's a combination that I use a good deal, especially in mixing colors for clouds. The heavy, dark gray color that indicates a cloud full of rain. Ultramarine blue, which is your warmer blue. It's closer to red than the phthalo is. That's why it's warmer. Ultramarine blue and orange, red orange, or warm red. So if I mix ultramarine blue and the warm red, because the warm red has a little bit more orange in it, it's going to create not so much purple as a slightly duller violet. It's not going to make a pure violet. It's going to make a more dull violet because the orange and the warm red will neutralize some of the blue. So that combined with a little bit of white can make a fantastic color for clouds. Now, another one of these combinations that, and those of you who have painted with me know this, one of my favorite combinations, it's another one that's made, a neutral that's made from close complements, colors that are close to each other as complements, green and violet. Makes a wonderful neutral. And green and the crimson makes a really rich black, because both of those are very dark colors. You can get a black from that that is incredibly rich by comparison with the ivory black that comes out of the tube. Another neutral that I use a lot, again, going to close complements, that tends to create some of the richest, is red orange and yellow green. So watch those mixtures as I show you how I put those together. And it's going to create a lighter, so value-wise it'll be lighter because those are lighter colors inherently, very rich neutral. So in addition to mixing like 3 values of a color so that you can create form, if you mix 3 different intensities of the color, you will create an even stronger sense of form. So let's look for a second here at some examples of those colors mixed on a palette. So I have to admit to being one of those who loves looking at palettes, because palettes contain all of these wonderful mixtures that you can create. Now, this one right here, and I have the video that I'm going to pull up in just a second where you can see me mixing some of these. And this one right here, this is geared mainly towards a fall palette. It's got a lot of violet undertones, and the shadow colors have violet in there. But I have mixed violet and ochre together. So here, this one is almost pure violet. It's got a little bit of green in it. Next one up, this is violet, mainly violet with a little bit of ochre. This is about half violet, half ochre. This is mainly ochre with a tiny little bit of violet. So when you have neutrals that are in a full range of intensity, going from one pure color to the other, you're going to get a much richer palette. And the mixture that I was talking about of that yellow green, so here's the yellow green, here's the red orange. When you mix those together, you get this. It's been neutralized a little bit more, but half and half ends up being this color right here, slightly neutralized green. So you can get some wonderful neutrals in there. Now, what I did to get this row in the middle right here, these are pretty much the colors down below with a little bit of white added into them. Remember, white and black will also neutralize a color. So there are 3 ways that you can neutralize a pure intense color. The first is to mix in its complement. The second is to mix white, and the third is to mix black. But I want you to look at the big difference here between the neutrals that are mixed from 2 complementary colors and the neutrals that have white added into them. And it makes a much less strong tint instead of that grayed down neutral. So look at one more couple more palettes and how I mixed some of those. Let's go to get to the next one that has some good neutrals on there. So this line of neutrals down here at the bottom is predominantly from violet and ochre. There is a little bit of blue in one or two of them, but it's mainly different proportions of violet and ochre with a little bit of white in it right here. So you can see the full range of, this one has a little bit more intensity to it. The violet has a tiny little bit of ochre in it and some white. This one is more of a pure, right in the middle neutral between the ochre and the violet. So here we have more ochre, here we have more violet. This one is smack dab in the center and it has a little bit more white in it. So this color over here, which doesn't appear to be that intense when it's all by itself, when it's placed next to something that's even more neutral, begins to sing with intensity. So you can fool the eye about the actual physical intensity of a color by putting it next to something that's a little bit duller. And that is exactly what I did in this painting right here. So the violet that's in that field, in the rows in the field, is that violet that you just saw on the palette. It's actually not that intense. But when it's put next to those dull greens and dull oranges, dull yellow oranges, it begins to sing with intensity. So you can actually create a strong contrast and intensity without using colors at full screaming hue and intensity. So one last little palette view here. Then I want you to see me mix a few, and I want to give us enough time for some questions in here too. So you can also, like I said, lower the intensity by adding white. You can see it up here, and this is a little bit better shot of that section of the palette. When you have pure color and you add white to it, there's a tipping point between where it actually gets a little bit brighter, because dye colors as transparent colors will appear to get brighter when you add a little bit of white to them. But then they'll hit a tipping point and they will start to become chalky and get duller very quickly. So this pink over on the right very quickly goes to slight pale pink when you add more white to it. So adding more white is going to very quickly dull it out. I think I have one more. Let's see if I can get to this. Okay, this row right here, this one is that violet and yellow ochre line again. The center one is about half and half. Then over here on the right, these are some neutrals made from that yellow-green and red-orange combination with a lot of white in there, because that still gives you intensity, but now we've got a lighter value. So those can be fantastic neutrals as well. So there's a place for adding white. There's a place for neutrals, but you want to play it off against super intense colors. So you can see down in that bottom row where I have very intense purples and greens and teals that are going into that final painting. So let's look really quickly here at a little bit of mixing. And I wanted to show you first some of the mixing with that red-orange, yellow-orange, and the green going in together. So let me just play this for a second, get the video to run. and you'll get a chance to see that mixture happening. So if it,
our most strong,
oops, I need to kill the sound on that. So I'm starting with that yellow orange and adding a little bit more yellow to it, and then we will gradually go down the line and dull that out. So you can see that when I'm doing that, one of the things that I do is to pull part of that mound out to go into the next mixture so that those two colors will remain closely related. Actually, I think this one is where I'm mixing the violet into the yellow. So this is a more pure yellow rather than the yellow ochre that I talked about earlier. So I've got yellow and yellow orange. I'm adding just a little bit of violet to it. It's going to be a lot stronger in intensity than if I'd used the yellow ochre for it. And one thing to remember too is that there is more than one way to mix the same color. So by adjusting the amount of violet, I can make that almost visually indistinguishable from a mixture that had yellow ochre in it instead of the more pure yellow, yellow orange, because the violet's going to dull out that pure yellow, yellow orange. So you can see where I took some of that, put it into the next one, and added some purple. So I'm beginning to take it on down the line into something that's more and more neutralized. The value is staying pretty close to the same, but the color is now a whole lot duller. A little bit more of the darker violet to actually pull the intensity back up and pull the value back down. So there you get a range of intensities from the lightest color being the brightest to the darkest color being the dullest. Again, contrast and intensity will give you a much richer painting. Now, if we look at the next one, see if I can hit it at the exact right spot here. So up above here, you can see where I've mixed those violet, yellow ochre neutrals. And then we're going to get some, of the green and pink mixture that I talked about coming in here. So we're going to get another range in there. Let's see if I get the, oops, it's going to go to the correct spot. I'm going to mix some of those lighter neutrals. So you can see how I'm pulling in the color from the darker ones underneath and adding in a little bit of white. And that creates the lighter and duller versions of those colors. So there's a whole range of possibilities in mixing neutrals. There's more out there than most people realize. You can create an awful lot of them simply by going to your double primary palette and fully utilizing those complementary colors, those close complements, so that you end up with more enriched color. So I'm going to stop that share right now and make sure I leave some time to answer questions. So let me know if you've got any questions about mixing neutrals right here in the chat roll. Pop a question in, and I've got about 15 minutes that I've left here for Q&A about mixing color and about how you might use neutrals. So let me know what your questions are. Remember that you want to keep a range of value, a range of hue, a range of intensity, and a range of temperature in your paintings. So let me know what your questions are. Kathy says, what's the pure purple that you use? That pure purple is one of my all-time favorites, Kathy. And it ends up on my palette in the same place each time. So this purple right here is Egyptian violet. So I'll type that here into the chat roll. It's Egyptian violet in Williamsburg. And it's also known as dioxazine violet in other brands. Oh boy, I can't spell. Violet. There. So if you look at a different brand, it might have a different name. So Egyptian violet is the color in Williamsburg, in Gamblin, in Holborn, in M. Graham, it's going to be dioxazine violet. If you go to Winsor Newton, it's going to be Windsor violet because they have to stick their proprietary name on there too. The pigment's the same in all of those. The difference in the paints just is in its thickness and its consistency. The Williamsburg is going to be really, really thick. I can take a small, 37 milliliter tube of Egyptian violet, which costs the earth in Williamsburg, and it'll last me a couple of years, even when I paint every day, because it just doesn't take very much of it. It's one of those super saturated colors like phthalo blue and phthalo green. Just doesn't take much. You can mix the equivalent if you take pure red, something towards the crimson side, and ultramarine blue. So whichever crimson you're using, if you mix that with ultramarine blue, you can make a color that you can't tell apart based on hue. It's just not going to be it's not going to have quite as strong a tinting strength. So it's absolutely possible to mix it, but it becomes a convenience color. So I've had the same big giant tube of Gamblin dioxazine violet for probably 5 years. It just doesn't, you don't use that much of it. So that little mound you see right there would last me probably a week because it doesn't dry really fast and because it's that strong. It's just a super, super saturated color. So it's worth buying a tube of it. If you need to save money and you don't want to buy the Williamsburg version, then buying one of the lower price versions on that particular color is a way you can save a little bit of cash. Laura says, what's the best way to keep background warm colors deep enough that they don't start shouting at you from the background and throw off atmospheric perspective? That depends on the lighting situation you're looking at, Laura. If you're looking away from the light, then that's going to be very different than if you're looking towards the light. So if you're looking towards the light, the background warm colors need to shout, actually, especially if it's sunset, sunrise, because that's what's going to give you that feeling of warmth and illumination. So if you're talking about looking away from the sun, then you're still going to want to neutralize those a little bit. So if I were talking about looking for one of those paintings, let me look and see which one of the paintings that I've got pulled up already. Yeah, here we go. Let me switch over to this one. This is a different time of day than you've seen so far. So this one, it's not switching. Sometimes Zoom is a little slow and it doesn't want to switch image. There we go. So this one is looking away from the light source. The light is coming over my shoulder from the right. And it's falling on that distant tree line. And because of the time of year this was spring, there's a lot of violet undertones in the shadows, a lot of light in that distant tree line, but it's not screaming. Those are still fairly neutralized colors, but they look stronger than they actually are because I'm contrasting complementary colors. So I make it look like light is hitting on the distant lavender tree line by using a slightly warmer but still neutral color for that illumination. So you can play off warm and cool of duller colors, and you're still going to create a sense of light. So that is just by playing off warm and cool, and then it won't shout at you. So this is traditional standard atmospheric perspective here, where you've got more contrast in the foreground and less contrast as you move back into space. And I just played with toning down the intensity, but contrasting the temperature and the hue. Virginia says, is that cobalt blue up there? Nope, because as you know, I don't use cobalts. That is a Provence violet. That was one of my Circe tubes that I gave myself that was on that palette. So she's talking about the palette that I showed you just a second ago, and the purple that was up towards the top. It is right up there at the top on the, next to the dioxazine violet is the purple, the Provence. I think it's Provence violet, if I can remember right, or maybe Provence blue, but I think it's something like that. It's another Williamsburg color, and it's a convenience color I let myself play with every now and then. It hardly ever goes out to paint plein air, even though I was out plein air that day. But it was a new tube, so I was playing with it. So up at the top of my palette, almost always, this is the order they go in. I do the violet right there, then I have the ultramarine and the phthalo. Those are always there. If I have the Provence blue in there, or if I have an ultramarine, French ultramarine blue, it'll go right there. Then on the other side, down towards the bottom, I'll have the other primaries. I'll have yellow ochre, Indian yellow, Fanchon red, and Carl's crimson. So that I've got the double primaries in an L shape on the right-hand side of the palette. And I just started doing that years ago as a way to not dip my sleeve into the paint as I mixed it. And for some reason, I'm more able to keep my hand out of the paint when it's over on that side. Then I create all the mixtures I'm going to paint with in the middle. So it's just a habit that I came up with. But no, I have one tube of cobalt blue that I still have in the studio that I bought probably 15 years ago and have never used up because I'm really not into using cobalt. I don't want the heavy metals in there. I'm not going to throw it away, but I will eventually use it up, but I won't buy any more. So you won't ever see it on any of the palettes that I show y'all. Not ever, ever, ever is there a cobalt on there of any sort, any way, shape, or form. Not cobalt violet, blue, and no cadmium, orange, red, or any of those other sorts of things. Marcia says, when you lay out your palette for a painting, how many neutrals of each form is something to think about? I tend to lay out colors that relate to each other. So you'll notice that these kind of are in rows. It's a habit I've developed over the years. So the sky colors, the lighter sky colors go at the top, the darker shadow colors, foliage colors go at the bottom. And in between are the different neutrals that I might need. So I generally work in groups of 3 so that I have a middle color, intensity or value, and a lighter, warmer, a cooler, darker. So you'll see they're kind of in groups of 3s here. And I consider sometimes the group of 4 to be connected like, oops, why is it doing that? Grab my marker. So this is one group of 3 for foliage. And you can see that in the painting of spring, because this is almost the same palette that I used in that painting that we were just looking at. We'll pop back over to it in a second. Then another set of 3 would be that. You can think of this as being a set of 3. This is being a set of 3. This is being a set of 3. Do you see how they all 3 relate to each other? I'm kind of moving up the color wheel as I go there. So there's a connection between every color on there. I never, ever, ever paint with paints straight out of the tube without adjusting them just a little bit. So I tend to work in triads of things. So I'm not sure if I answered your question there, Marcia, but I think I did. Virginia, on the palette before this one or the palette before that? The one up above it, the other one that had a lot of blues, this one? Okay, good. That's what I thought you meant. Eileen says, how do you keep your palette so neat? Mine is so messy. Let's go back to that video for a second. And I think therein, I know therein lies the answer. So make sure I've got the right one. Let's just look at this one for a second. See if I can get the right one. Actually, let me switch to this other one, because I think it actually shows how I mix it a little bit more clearly. So I'm using that number 81 flat-ended palette knife, and watch how I do that. It's plow and turn, plow and turn. So I plow it and then I turn it. And if you plow and turn enough, the paint gets thoroughly mixed, and you can kind of pull it back into a mound so it never spreads out. The problem that a lot of people have is they use the wrong knife to mix. They use the official palette knife that has that curved end, and that's a terrible knife to mix with. This one is so much easier to mix with because you can do that plow and that turn with it. So I always use that. Y'all saw when we talked about palette knives the other month, that flat end number 81 makes a great knife to mix with. So you can see here how I was mixing those three. This goes back to your question, I think, Marcia, that, you know, I'm working in groups of three. So I've squeezed out a color there, an ochre. It's actually a green ochre. And then I'm going to add different things to it to make them lean one or the other direction according to intensity. So I'm adding the purple into that, and it's going to make a dark, dulled out purple. Makes what looks like a real brownish purple until it gets put next to something that's kind of a contrast to it. Put it next to an ochre and it's going to become really purple looking, but it looks really dull when it's in mass tone like that. Then I took just a little bit what was on the knife and mixed it into the next color. And that ends up being kind of the middle color there. So it's more ochre and less violet. And I'll adjust and tweak that just a little bit there, but watch the plow and turn again too. So I'm trying to adjust it so it's about halfway in between. So I've got a range of intensities there and a range of hues. So that is how I do it there. So I plow and I turn, and it makes it way easier, Eileen, to keep it in neat piles. It's also really meditative as you're mixing paint. Sharon says, do you ever need to mix more of a color when you're painting? Every now and then I will, hardly ever, but every now and then I will. So if I've got a little bit of it still left there, it's really easy to come close to matching that color. It doesn't have to be an exact match. It just needs to be a little close. If you get too hung up on trying to make an exact match, you make your painting too matchy. You're much better off if you are instead getting approximate matches there. But you'll notice I'm making big piles of paint, and that was for a fairly small painting. That was, I believe, a 5x7 that I was getting ready to paint. So I've got large piles of paint. That's enough paint for 2 paintings easily. And paint dries at different rates. So as the earth colors, which dry faster, begin to dry out, I use those up and I'll replace those and use them for the next painting. the ones that are dye colors will stay wet longer. So great questions, y'all. We've got time for about one more question. I'm gonna scroll back up and make sure I'm not skipping anything. So let me know if you have any other questions about those neutrals. I want to go back to the palette really quickly here, and then that final painting, because I want you to see. So this is a palette. I didn't actually mix this for this painting, but the colors are almost exactly the same in the painting. So I want you to see the range here. And then look at a painting that's using those exact same colors. Back to the one of spring. And you can see those same colors and how intense some of those neutrals look when they're in contrast with colors that are even more neutral. So neutrals are the secret sauce. They definitely are. Ooh, that's a good question, Sharon. Sharon's saying, how large is my palette? It depends. My day tripper that I paint on when I'm out plein air, and that is the black palette box that you're seeing right here. The day tripper is, let me turn around and look at it. It's about 12 by 18, something like that. It might be 12 by 16 on the inside. So it's a nice, fairly large space. Then when I'm working on bigger paintings, my palette is 18 by 24. So I like a big, the palette size goes up in proportion to the painting. The other palette box, plein air box that I use a lot is an open box M, and it's 10 by 12 inches. Love that one too. So I don't have to have a huge box to use when I'm painting outside. So the size of the palette can change in proportion with the size of the painting. And stop the share there for a minute. I'm going to reach up here and I'm going to grab, I think I may have shown this to y'all before, one of my favorite plein air boxes. So when we're talking about the size of the palette, so I made this one. This is a cigar box. And you just put the panel in the top and stick it in there. And that's the size of the palette down below. It's 6 by 8 inches. So you can see the size of those piles of paint, and that's for about a 4 by 6 inch painting. I could use them for a 5 by 7, but it's a tiny little palette. It's a 6 by 8 inch piece of plexiglass that fits inside the cigar box. It's just a plexi scrap that I cut to fit into the cigar box. The inside of the cigar box then holds, you see those little pieces of foam core right here? Those are just stuck in here. I cut them to fit inside. They're 1 inch tall. And I can actually put a regular tube of paint in here. What I've got in here right now are the little itty bitty tubes so that I can go out and paint with something that's even lighter. And I cut it myself, Marcia. I have paint plexi scraps that sit in the studio, and I used to have an easier access to a glass cutter. I don't cut glass, but I absolutely will cut plexiglass. You can go to any glass and plastic store. So think about a store that sells glass or plastic for autos. And I'm willing to bet that some of those are still open, and you can do some sort of curbside pickup if you need to. And you can order it to fit whatever size palette box you have. So I drop that plexi down into the palette box so that it stays airtight. Anne says, how do you cut plexiglass? It depends on how thick it is. If you've got a metal ruler and one of those box cutters, you can use that. You have to score it and then crack it. We had a machine at the college that was a glass cutter, A nice expensive one that hooked onto the wall that you could just go whoosh with a blade and it cut the plexi. Don't have access to that anymore, but the glass and plastics shop can do that for you. Lowe's and Home Depot will cut plexiglass. So for the big palette box, for when I'm painting in the studio on big paintings, I like large pieces of thick plexiglass. And so I've got a big scrap that goes into my 18 by 24 inch box. And it has the paper still on the back so that I've got a nice tan neutral back to it. So that works beautifully. So when you get a chance to later, when we get back to our more of our older kind of normal, you can search through the scrap bin in a glass and plastic shop and find scraps that you can use. But until then, you can order them. So that will work. So I just cut it myself. Now, you be careful if you're using a box cutter and a metal straight edge to cut plexiglass. That's a really good way to cut your finger. So I would love to not have y'all do that. I had a rule when I was teaching at the college about blood. No blood was allowed, and I would tell them at the beginning of the semester that if they cut themselves and bled, I was going to take off a letter grade of their final grade. So, because I turn green at the sight of blood. Y'all don't do things like that. Get somebody else to cut it for you. Eileen, the box that's 18 by 24 is a Richardson French Mistress box. And I don't know if y'all can see. I'm going to duck down here. And where did my pointer tool go? Shoot. My marker tool just disappeared. It's right here. This thing that looks like a wooden suitcase right here is my Richardson box. And it's probably bigger than 24. It's probably 30. It's big. And that is, they call it a French Mistress. And what it is it opens out. So it has two wings, just like the Day Tripper does. It's just a much larger box, and it's designed to go with either a studio easel or a French easel. It'll work with either one. I don't know why they call it a French Mistress, other than they do, and they've called it that for a couple of hundred years. So, but that's what it is. And I use that to keep the paint fresh. I close it up at the end of every paint session and have clove oil on a Q-tip in there to keep the paint fresh. So I don't use my Masterson box very much anymore, the plastic box to drop a palette down in. I tend to use the wooden boxes more. So I love that French Mistress. It holds my big palette really nicely. It's a great size, and it's great for the size panel you see over there on the easel. It needs to be a big palette for a big painting. Don't try to skimp with a little palette on a big painting. It won't work. Yeah, the lid doesn't come off completely. The lid folds out. So I will unfold it and y'all can watch and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's as simple as that. So the lid falls back, and yes, you can mix on the sides too. I don't. I mix in the middle, and I use the sides to hold my palette knives or my brushes. And you can see that the piece of plexi I have under there right now is completely clear. My other one is over on the side waiting to be cleaned. And I've got a piece of neutral paper underneath it. It's a light tan because, as y'all know, I tend to tone my panels with yellow ochre. So yeah, Anne says she has one like that and didn't know that was what it was called. Yeah, I love it. It's one of my favorite tools in the studio. So yes, you definitely can mix on the sides, but you would have to put some plexi over there, Virginia, or clean off the wood, not worry about paint getting on the wood. Yes, Virginia, you could paint a piece of paper, thin yellow ochre, and put it underneath. The paper that's on my other palette that's stuck on there by adhesive is that color. It's just not quite as intense. So it works really beautifully. I don't want to mix on the sides. I use that to hold my tools. It holds tubes of paint on one side. I tend to put the paint on the left and the tools on the right, and then I'm ready to dive in. Virginia says I would put plexi on one side and the tools on the other. Here's the reason why I wouldn't put the plexi on there. Because what are you going to do with that piece of plexi when you close it up? Because the whole purpose is you can close the box at the end of the day and the paint won't dry out. And if you've got paint mixing on that other side, you're not going to be able to do that. So that's why I'm mixing in the middle. I mean, if you really got wild and needed more space, you could do that for sure. But you'd want to pull the paint off of those wings. That's what the open part are called. You don't want to pull the paint off of the wings when you closed it up at night, or it can make a big mushy mess in the middle. So yeah, it's a very convenient piece of equipment, and I, at this point, could not live without it. So you can see where I've kind of jerry-rigged. I'm using a TV table right in front of the easel to hold the palette box. Now I've got a tray holder that I use normally that's still in pieces, haven't put it together yet, back together again yet, that normally goes in front of my easel. It's a little bit higher, a better height. That's actually too low in a lot of ways, so I have to raise it up to really use it. You don't want to have to be leaning down into your palette box as you're mixing your paint. So great question. And Virginia, it does to a degree, but not that much, because I'm not on top of the canvas as I paint. Now I have it pulled out right now so that I could open it up. If I was painting, I would be pushing it back underneath the easel a bit. So I'm not as far away from it as it would look like I would be right there. So it's just pulled out so I could open it up. You actually don't stand on top of the canvas. I stand to paint. I don't sit to paint. So when I'm standing up, I'm not literally on top of it anyway. And the palette box comes out about this far. So it's a comfortable distance. If I need to, I can move it further underneath. So, no, and the distance doesn't. So I'll show you where it normally sits. So it's normally a good 6 inches underneath the edge there of the easel. And I'm willing to bet, Anne, that you're standing that far away from it too, because you need that much space to be able to move your arm back and forth. So hardly any of us are that close. I used to think that was a problem too until I really started doing it that way, and I really like that better. I used to put my palette to the right and thinking that I didn't have enough room for it. And actually working plein air got me over that. Working with day trippers showed me that I really don't need to be right on top of the easel. So great questions, y'all. And I think I have caught them all now. So yeah, try putting it underneath your easel, and it's the up down motion. It just saves so much time. And it was just moving it closer to where the palette box normally is on my plein air easel. So anything that feels more comfortable is going to make you have an easier time of painting in flow. So go for it. And let me know if y'all have any questions later. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you see some ways where you can start weaving in using neutrals to really set off the color and the intensity of your other paints. So happy painting, everybody. I look forward to talking with you again soon. Remember, stay resilient, wash your hands, and paint on. We're going to be fine. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye for now.